thanks everyone at the American Library. This is a beautiful place, and thank you all for coming on a Sunday night, which I guess is a proper time to talk about Jesus. Let me just start, if I may, telling you a little bit about who I am. As Grant said, I was born in Iran. I often joke that I come from a long line of lukewarm Muslims and exuberant atheists. My mother was the lukewarm Muslim, my father the exuberant atheist. You know, the kind of atheist who always has a pocket full of Prophet Muhammad jokes that he would pull out at inappropriate times, that kind of atheist. When the Iranian Revolution happened in 1979, as you recall, when that happened, the Ayatollah Khomeini, when he returned to Iran, said that he had no interest in any kind of political role for the state, that he just wanted to go back to his home and his studies and his family. My father, who never trusted anyone in a turban, took one look at that and said, bullshit, and thought that it might be a good idea for us to leave Iran until things settled down. Obviously, that was 35 years ago. Things did not settle down. Turns out my father was right, which he reminds me about on a daily basis. And so we grew up mostly in the Bay Area of California. This was, of course, the 1980s. Not sure if you remember the 1980s. Not exactly the best time to be Iranian in America, as opposed to now, when it's fantastic. This was at the height of the Iran hostage crisis, 444 days in which Americans were being held hostage in the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, and for a 7-year-old boy trying his hardest not to stick out, to fit in, I did everything in my power to kind of separate myself from my culture, my heritage, certainly my religious tradition, what little of it that we actually observed. In fact, I often admitted that I spent a good part of the 1980s pretending to be Mexican. Which, by the way, tells you how little I understood about America. That I thought that they would treat me better if I said I was Mexican. So, did not really know what I was doing. But I was always deeply interested in religion and spirituality. And I'm not even sure why. As I say, I did not grow up in any kind of religious environment. We were culturally Muslim the way that most people are culturally religious. I think part of it may have had to do with the revolutionary images, or the images, I should say, of revolutionary Iran, that sort of seared themselves in my consciousness. I mean, I'd always been deeply interested in the power that religion has to transform a society, for good and for bad. But never really had an opportunity to actually do anything about that interest in religion or spirituality until when I was in high school. When I was 15 years old, I went with some friends to an evangelical youth camp in Northern California. And it was there that I first heard the gospel story, this incredible story, the greatest story ever told, of the God of heaven and earth coming down in the form of a baby and of dying for our sins, and this incredible promise that whoever believes in him would also never die but have eternal life. I had never heard anything like this before in my life. It was a transformative experience for me. I immediately converted to this particularly conservative brand of evangelical Christianity, and then spent the next 4 or 5 years preaching that gospel as I had heard it to everyone I met, whether they wanted to hear it or not, frankly. And then when I went to university, I decided that this was what I was going to do for a living. I was going to study the New Testament for a living, and it was at that point that I was confronted with this problem that pretty much everyone in my situation is confronted with, which is the sudden realization that pretty much everything that I thought I knew about Jesus was incomplete, if not incorrect. That indeed there was this chasm, if you will, between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history. And although at that moment I began to be just absolutely confronted with this dichotomy, this kind of sudden realization that these are two different people, Christ and Jesus. I also simultaneously found myself being far more interested in the historical Jesus, in the Jesus of history. He was more real to me. He became more accessible and appealing to me. And although I ultimately separated myself from the Christ of faith, I became an even more devoted follower of the Jesus of history. And indeed, that was sort of the impetus for this book. Now, this, I think, is the first sort of understanding that we all need to come to in this room to have this discussion, this recognition that the Jesus of history is different than the Christ of faith. And indeed, the entire quest for the historical Jesus is predicated upon separating these two, which is, of course, a very difficult thing to do. This attempt to dig through the layer upon layer, the century upon century of dogma and doctrine, of legend and myth that have arisen over the person of Jesus, and to get as much as is possible to the man himself is an extraordinary difficult enterprise. Indeed, it's so difficult that most scholars, even most historians of the historical Jesus, will admit that it's a useless enterprise, that we just simply cannot access the historical Jesus, and so therefore we should just focus on the only Jesus that we can access, the Christ of faith. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about why I disagree with that view. And the first reason that I disagree with it is because that view assumes that the Christ of faith is easy to access. And of course, he is not. Because the first question you have to ask yourself when you're talking about the Christ of faith is, which Christ of faith are you talking about? Are you talking about this guy? This is what I like to call the Fox News Jesus. Blonde, blue-eyed, probably speaks with a British accent. You know, I call him that because if you recall, in December, a very, very prominent Fox News personality by the name of Megyn Kelly quite famously said that Jesus Christ and Santa Claus are both white. She said, it's a fact. Yes. So in case you were wondering, Jesus Christ and Santa Claus are both white. Funny, I'll tell you one very funny story about this. Every time Fox News says anything about Jesus, it's great for me. And so I was asked to go on a news show and talk about this issue, and the other panelist was William Donahue, who is the sort of bloviating head of this very right-wing organization called the Catholic League. And when asked about Megyn Kelly's statement, William Donahue said, well, he's white in all the paintings. You're kidding. I swear that's what he said. He's white in all the paintings. Which, by the way, is not true, but regardless. The interesting thing, however, is that Megyn Kelly is right. Her Jesus Christ is white. Because the thing about the Christ of faith is that, and why it is so difficult for us to access him, is that he is infinitely malleable. If you are a upper middle class, suburbanite, then this is your Jesus. But if you live in Africa, your Jesus is something else entirely. Your Jesus represents who you are, and indeed, the very notions of the gospel stories take on the culture, the affinities that you yourself represent. If you're Chinese, guess what? Your Jesus is Chinese. If you're Korean, your Jesus is Korean. And interestingly enough, the Jesus that you worship not only takes on your cultural affinities, but it'll take on your political and your religious affinities as well. Remove the cross from this picture, and who do you see? That's right. Politically, of course, Jesus can be whomever you want him to be. It all depends on your own story, how you define yourself. Jesus can be an African slave. Jesus can be a warrior taking up arms against the oppressor. This, of course, the Latin American Jesus is familiar to a lot of us who know about liberation theology. And while it may be offensive to some to think of Jesus as carrying a rifle, I have to remind you that the notion of Jesus as warrior is about as old as Jesus himself. The idea of Jesus carrying a sword, as Revelation refers to him, in his blood-soaked garments, coming wielding the sword of God to smite the enemies of God. That conception of Jesus goes back 2,000 years. And again, as disconcerting as this kind of image of Jesus may be to some of you, it shouldn't be any less disconcerting than the more traditional Jesus as king. This, of course, is about as historically inaccurate as it can possibly get. But this image, this very popular image of Jesus, one that most Christians wouldn't bat an eye when they see, is one that I think is about as historically relevant as the Jesus with a rifle slung over his shoulder. And as we noticed, of course, it's not just culture, it's not just ethnicity, it's not just your political, your social views. Most importantly, it's your religious conception that also syncretizes itself with the Christ of faith. And so when we go to India, what we see is a Jesus who has become Krishna. This is Jesus, not Krishna. But you could never tell the difference between the two. In Thailand, Jesus is often seen as blue, as though he himself is a Hindu god, and indeed he is a Hindu god. So my problem with this kind of notion that we should focus on the Christ of faith rather than the Jesus of history is that in many ways the Christ of faith is just as inaccessible to us as the Jesus of history. So, how do we then separate this infinitely malleable conception of Christ from the Jesus of history, who, while maybe buried in shadow, is nevertheless frozen in time? How do we get to him? Well, it's a very long process. It's a very, very difficult process, but I would argue that it begins with the fundamental recognition of one unavoidable fact. It's a postulate, if you will, for you mathematicians. And that postulate is this: the Jesus of history was a Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews. The Jesus of history was a Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews. It seems simple. It seems obvious, in fact. And yet, it is the key to separating the Christ of faith from the Jesus of history. Because what it forces us to do is to take everything that Jesus says or does and to filter it through a very specific lens. The lens of a Jew, and by the way, not just a Jew, but a poor, pious Galilean Jew. We can talk a little bit about how that makes Jesus a little bit different. But a poor, pious Galilean Jew would say or do. That is the beginning of the quest for the historical Jesus. A quest that's been going on, as I say, for 200 years. There's nothing new about what I'm talking about. So, what does this mean? Well, it begins by, first of all, understanding the world in which Jesus lived, and by defining him according to his world. This is a world that we know a good deal about. It is a world that is being under this sort of control of a dominant priestly aristocracy, represented by the high priest here. The high priest at this time, of course, was a figure of both religious and political and even economic renown. The temple priesthood was not just the physical, literal dwelling place of the Spirit of God. It was the center of political life. It was the largest bank. It controlled almost every aspect of life for the Jews in Jesus' time. And yet, this was also a time in which it had become this bloated, wealthy aristocracy that was growing enormously wealthy, based on the tithes and the taxes that it was collecting from Jews around the world. In fact, most Jews, and certainly poor Jews like Jesus, would have seen the entire priestly aristocracy as, the way Josephus, the great Jewish historian, describes them, as a bunch of avaricious lovers of luxury. For them, the entire temple, and as a result, the entire land, had been defiled by their corruption and their greed and ineptitude. Of course, this was also a time that was dominated by a new class of Jews. We refer to them sometimes as the Herodian elite. This is Herod the Great, the sort of Hellenistic, Romanized king of the Jews, who really stamped his ideals upon the city of Jerusalem. Even today, when you go and see Jerusalem, what you are seeing is Herod's Jerusalem. The Herodian elite were a class of wealthy Jews that, by essentially marrying themselves to the Roman occupation, had managed to accumulate an enormous amount of wealth. Again, based on the backs of the vast majority of Jews who really were in a situation of almost indentured servitude. I mean, we're talking about this enormous divide between the very, very rich, this tiny elite, and the vast majority of Jews in Jesus' time who were very, very poor. And of course, all of these forces were under the thumb of the Roman Empire. The most important thing to know about Jesus' world is that he lived in a land that was militarily occupied by this pagan heathen power that in many ways sort of really ruled the lives of every individual from the distance of Rome. So when we talk about Jesus, that's what we are talking about. And when we think about Jesus, we have to think about what these primary symbols that represent his life actually mean. For many Christians, of course, the symbol of Jesus on the cross is an image that reflects the sacrifice of God for all of us, for all of our sins. But that is the Christ of faith. That is how one looks at the Christ of faith on the cross. If we are looking at the Jesus of history on the cross, then we have to understand what this image means based on everything else that I just told you, the powers in which he lived, the world in which he lived. What is often not understood by many people is that crucifixion was a punishment that Rome reserved exclusively for crimes against the state. Crimes like sedition, treason, rebellion, insurrection. These were the only crimes for which you could be crucified in Jesus' time. Of course, people always bring up this notion that, well, Jesus was crucified alongside two thieves, was he not? No, he was not, actually. The Greek word lestai, which is the word that the Gospels use, does not mean thieves. It can mean thieves. Kleptai means thieves. But lestai means something else entirely. Lestai means bandits. And bandit was the most common term in Jesus' time for an insurrectionist, for a rebel. Indeed, Jesus himself in the Gospels is on more than one occasion called a bandit himself. So, do you see how these images, their meaning, their significance changes whether you're talking about the Christ of faith or the Jesus of history? The Christ of faith is an innocent, celestial being dying amidst two thieves for the sins of humanity. And that is a perfectly valid interpretation of the Christ of faith. The Jesus of history, however, is one of three rebels against the state being crucified at the same time. This ideal, this notion of this separation, becomes not just the fundamental key in separating the Jesus of history from the Christ of faith, but it then allows us to, if you will, move backwards from the cross through Jesus' life and begin to re-examine these sort of famous stories that we all know, stories that we've all heard, through the lens, not just of his time and place, but even more specifically, of this cross, of this image of a man, a rebel against the state, being executed for the crime of treason. So let's do that together, if you don't mind. When we are talking about the historical Jesus, what we are talking about is, as I've already said a couple of times, a poor, and when I say poor, I mean poorest of the poor. If the Gospels are right in calling him a tekton, which we often refer to as a carpenter, but which means something else entirely. It means a builder, a woodworker. And this is, again, another important point to keep in mind, because carpenter means something kind of different, doesn't it? Carpenter, I love movies about Jesus. Any movie about Jesus I will go see, because I always love that one scene in which, Jesus is in his shop, his carpentry shop, right? Building like a table or something. Someone, may I help you? As though he's some sort of, small business owner. That's not what tekton means. Tekton means builder. A tekton is a day laborer, is an artisan. In fact, the primary, what a tekton actually does is go from village to village looking for work, looking for things to build. Tekton was a word that was considered so lowly, the job of a tekton was considered so lowly that the Romans actually used the word tekton as a swear word. They used it as slang for any kind of uncouth and illiterate peasant. And the Jesus of history was very likely both those things. In fact, by most estimates, a day laborer or artisan, which is sort of what Jesus would be, was about at the second lowest level of the social hierarchy in first century Palestine, just above the slave, the indigent, and the beggar. Are you getting an idea about how poor Jesus is? Because I really want to make sure that you understand, because this becomes pivotal in sort of understanding his teachings about the kingdom of God. He's poor, he's pious, he lives in the backwoods of Galilee, in a village called Nazareth, a village that probably had maybe 100 families total. A village that, as far as we know, didn't have a single road, a single bath, didn't even have a synagogue, didn't have a school. Like the vast majority of his fellow Jews, by some scholarly estimates, anywhere between 95 and 98% of the Jews in first century Palestine, Jesus could not read or write. He was illiterate. He probably had no education whatsoever, save for the education provided by his father as an apprentice. And yet, this poor, pious peasant from the backwoods of Galilee, what we would nowadays refer to as a country peasant, a bumpkin, if you will, was able to, through the power of his charisma, through the power of his teachings, form a movement on behalf of the poor, the weak, the dispossessed, the marginalized, women especially. It's very interesting, the role that women played in Jesus' ministry. A movement that was such a threat to the stability of the state that he was hunted down like a criminal, arrested, tortured, and executed for treason against Rome. That is the Jesus of history. And it's a Jesus that, for many of us, is unfamiliar. Because when we look at the gospel stories, we are not looking at them in the context of Jesus' time. And that makes perfect sense. That's absolutely logical. I mean, after all, if you believe that Jesus is God, then what does context matter? Who cares where he was born or what language he spoke? His words are eternal. His actions are universal. But again, you are talking about the Christ of faith. We are talking about the Jesus of history. And everything that Jesus of history says or does has to be not just seen in the context of his time, but through the filter with which we began this discussion. A Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews. So let's do it. Now, moving back from the cross, let's just take one of these familiar stories, a story that we all have heard in one way or another. And this, of course, is the triumphal entry into Jerusalem and the cleansing of the temple. It's very interesting about Jesus. I say that he was a Galilean, and that's a very important part about it, that he's poor, and that's very important. What's fascinating is that the entirety of his ministry, which may have lasted somewhere between 18 and 36 months, the entire, in the entirety of his ministry was spent in these tiny villages, these backward villages, and exclusively in the Galilee, preaching to poor people like himself, except for the last 3 days of his entire ministry. One day, without sort of any kind of real explanation to his disciples, after having spent all of their time in these Galilean villages, Jesus says, let's go to Jerusalem. In fact, what he really says is, let's go to Jerusalem and die. Famously, Jesus says, as he's going to Jerusalem, he tells his disciples, if anybody wants to follow me, then he needs to take up his cross and follow me. And of course, Christians interpret that as, in an acontextual way, as meaning that what Jesus is saying is that following him in a spiritual manner means denying oneself, dying to oneself. Again, a perfectly valid explanation for the Christ of faith. The Jesus of history, however, is talking about something that everyone would have understood immediately, because the cross means one thing and one thing only. It is the execution for treason. Jesus is saying, let's go kill ourselves. And they do. He comes into Jerusalem in the famous story, right? Riding on a donkey. According to the story, his followers wave palm branches in the air, which of course is the symbol for the Maccabean victory against the Greek Empire, the Empire of Antiochus. So it's a symbol of victory over a pagan empire. It's the last time that the city was actually held captive by a pagan empire. Other disciples put cloaks down on the ground. This is, of course, what the Jews did when King Jehu declared himself king of the Jews and entered Jerusalem. And so all of a sudden, this image, this tableau, which has this notion of humility to it. After all, look at him. He's a humble person riding on an ass. Doesn't have that humility aspect to it anymore. And indeed, Jesus himself recognizes that. The Gospels say that he meticulously orchestrated this entrance. He told his disciples to do this entire tableau in fulfillment of the prophet Zechariah, who said, rejoice greatly, daughter of Zion. Cry out, daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you, righteous and victorious is he, humble and riding upon an ass, upon a colt, the son of a donkey. The message to the Jewish inhabitants of Jerusalem could not be any clearer. Jesus is declaring himself to be the king, and that he is entering Jerusalem to reestablish his kingdom. And indeed, as provocative as that entrance is, it pales in comparison to what Jesus does next. It's the famous story in which Jesus creates a whip of cords and begins to cleanse the temple. He kicks out the money changers and the merchants there selling animals for sacrifice. He clears the area in this sort of supreme act of violence, and then raises his voice above the din to quite famously say, it is written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations, but you have made it a den of thieves. The authorities, of course, are absolutely irate here. I mean, they have no idea what's going on. They have no idea who this person is. He's walked into Jerusalem declaring himself king, and then he's taken part in this clear act of treason, because you remember, the Roman occupation and the priestly aristocracy, they are one and the same. In fact, the high priest was chosen by Rome, and Rome would often dismiss the high priest whenever they sort of failed to please them for one reason or another. In fact, The Roman governor would actually seize the high priest's garments and his sacred vestments, the tools that he used to communicate with God. That was under the possession of the Roman governor, who would just give it to the high priest whenever he needed it for his duties. In fact, if there's any misunderstanding about how closely aligned the Roman occupation and the priesthood were, it was dispelled by the fact that the Roman governor, in Jesus' time Pontius Pilate, actually resided in the Antonia fortress, which was literally attached to the temple. That's about as significant a symbol as it gets about how closely aligned these two groups were. So any attack on the temple is unquestionably also an attack on the occupation. But more importantly, for these Jews, the priesthood, they're absolutely flabbergasted by Jesus' entire actions. You see, Jesus is actually wrong. There is absolutely no law that forbids the sale of this material, or the changing of monies, or indeed even the presence of Gentiles in what is called the court of Gentiles. This is that wide piazza that you see. The temple itself is actually what's in the center. And yes, the center of the temple was off limits to everyone except Jews, and the inner sanctum was off limits to anyone except Jewish men, and then as you get closer to the center, only the priests, and then as you get to the very heart of the temple, the so-called Holy of Holies, only the high priest. But insofar as the court of Gentiles goes, anyone could be there. Which is why the priestly authorities are so confused by Jesus' actions. And so they decide that they are going to lay a trap for him, the Gospels say. Now, it's interesting because the Gospels very clearly say that this is a trap for Jesus, but they don't actually tell us what the trap is, and we are 2,000 years removed from it, so the context gets lost to us. You remember this story. This is when they go up to Jesus and they hand him, or they don't hand him a coin, they go up to Jesus and they say, "Rabbi, you seem like a godly person, an honest person. We have a question for you. Is it lawful to pay the tribute to Caesar or not?" Now, this is not a question. It's a trap. We were told it's a trap. But again, because we are removed from the context, we don't know what the trap means. This question, which again is not a question, is in fact the quintessential marking of a zealot. Who are the zealots? The zeal, the very concept of zeal, as some of you may know, is an ancient biblical ideal. It goes all the way back to the Torah. And in fact, the very notion of zeal is embedded in the nature of God. The Lord your God is a devouring fire, a jealous God, the Torah says. Zeal arose as a way of defining someone who is marked by his uncompromising devotion to the Torah, to the law of Moses. His refusal to serve any master, certainly any human master, but any master other than God, and his commitment to establishing the sole sovereignty of God. All the great heroes, prophets, kings of the Hebrew Bible, all of them are marked for being zealous for the Lord. And indeed, in Jesus' time, most Jews would have proudly referred to themselves as zealots. But there were a group of Jews who took this concept of zealotry to its logical conclusion. It begins many, many years before. In fact, in the very year in which Jesus is born, 4 BC, with a man by the name of Judas the Galilean. Judas the Galilean is one of dozens of messiahs that arose in the first century. I write about 11 or 12 of them in the book. But Judas is one of the most famous ones. Judas the Galilean was a zealot to the core, refused to acknowledge the sovereignty, not just of Caesar, but of anyone except God. And for Judas, for him, the paying of tribute became the sort of the most obvious sign of the subservience of the Jews to Caesar, to this, this heathen emperor who dominated the land that God had set aside strictly for his chosen people and no one else. The tribute, and by the way, I should just stop and explain exactly what the tribute is, because sometimes people mistake it for the taxes. Everybody had to pay taxes. And taxes were based on, the yield that you produced as a peasant, as a farmer. But every male, every Jewish male had to pay a tribute, which was a denarius coin, just one coin every year to Caesar directly. Not to the empire, not to Rome, but to Caesar directly. And that tribute was a sign that you were the subject person. You were subject to Caesar. You can understand why a zealot like Judas would want to have absolutely nothing to do with this, because the tribute was admission that the Jews belonged to Caesar, that the land itself was Caesar's land and not God's land. And so Judas the Galilean started a revolution in 4 BC that was based on the refusal to pay the tribute. This revolution lasted about 10 years or so, until the year 6 AD, in which Judas and his followers broke into a town in the Galilee called Sepphoris. They stole the weapons from the Sepphoris army, and they launched a final attack against Rome, a foolhardy attack. All of Judas's followers were sacrificed. They were all slaughtered, including Judas himself. 2,000 of his followers were crucified en masse. But that's not how Rome does things. So Rome, after having finished with the rebels, then marched to Sepphoris, and as punishment for having, not of their own accord, given up their weapons to Judas, they burned the city to the ground. They killed every man, and they sold all the women and children into slavery. The village of Nazareth is right here. About an hour walk from Sepphoris. Jesus would have been 10 years old when this event took place, and he would have undoubtedly been aware of it, because immediately after the Romans finished with Sepphoris, they gave it over to Herod the Great's son, Herod Antipas, who then decided to rebuild it from the ground up as the seat of his tetrarchy. And you can be absolutely certain that Jesus and his family, who were wandering builders, would have spent the next 10, 15 years of their lives traveling the 1 hour distance from their mud and brick village into Sepphoris to build what became the grandest, the most palatial city the Galilee had ever known. And so you can be darn sure that he was aware of Judas the Galilean, whose revolution may have been stifled, but whose radical preachings about zealotry, and most specifically, the refusal to pay the tribute, became so widespread among the Jews at the time that Josephus refers to it as a virus that was spreading from body to body. So then, now we have a poor, pious, illiterate, uneducated Jew from the backwoods of Galilee, who from the time he's about 10 years old to the time he's about 20-something years old, spends 6 days a week, sun up to sundown, with his family, very likely traveling to Sepphoris, building these palatial mansions for these deeply Romanized Herodian elite, traveling back to his home 6 days a week at sundown, back to his mud and brick home. And that obviously has a deep effect on him, because, as I argue in the book, and I won't get into too deeply in this conversation, his entire ministry bears the scars of this doctrine of zealotry. And nowhere are those scars more obvious than in this trick question. Let's forget about that. This trick question. So now let's get back to it. So, When they come to him and they say, Rabbi, should we pay the tribute or not? Again, it's a trap. What they are really saying is, are you a zealot or not? That's what they are saying. Now, Jesus' answer is what? Right? It's like the most famous thing he ever said. Render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's, render unto God that which is God. That is the King James translation, and it is to this day the most popular version of that saying. And no wonder, because what it seems to imply is that Jesus is saying, this is a irrelevant question, I'm not interested in the question, that really whatever is Caesar's, whatever is God's, and so we should instead focus our energies on that which is God's. Don't worry about the things of this world, worry about the things of the next world. That is the traditional interpretation of something that the Christ of faith said. The Christ of faith is without context. But the Jesus of history is living in a specific moment. He is addressing very specific people, and he's being asked a very specific question. And that is not at all how Jesus responds. The Greek word apodidomi, which is the word that Jesus uses, doesn't mean render. In fact, it's two words. It's a construction. Apo means back again, and didomi means to give. What Jesus is saying is give back. That's what he is saying. Give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. Give back to God what is God's. Now let's look at this again. Jesus says, let me see the coin. So they give him the denarius coin. Then he says, whose pitcher is this? And they say, it's Caesar's pitcher. And he says, whose name is this? And they say, it's Caesar's name. And then he says, well then, give back to Caesar that which is Caesar's. This coin, it has his name and his picture on it. And give back to God that which is God's. What is God's? The land. That's right. The land is God's. This is the most quintessential zealot statement that you could make at the time. And indeed, it's enough to arrest him almost on the spot. What does he do immediately after this moment? He tells his disciples to arm themselves. He says, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. And then they go into hiding in the Garden of Gethsemane, which, because it has this beautiful title, Garden of Gethsemane, sometimes is imagined as though it's a place of bubbling fountains and picnic tables. The Garden of Gethsemane is a forest. It's where you go to hide when the authorities are coming to get you. And indeed, all four Gospels say that when the forces come to arrest Jesus, they are fully armed to the teeth. The Gospel of John actually says a cohort of Roman soldiers go to arrest Jesus. A cohort is 500 Roman soldiers. Now, John is obviously exaggerating for effect, but all the Gospels say that temple guards and Roman soldiers, together armed with swords and clubs, go to find this pacifistic preacher of good works with no concern about the cares of this world. They arrest him. They charge him with sedition against the state, and they execute him as a rebel. And the charge for which he is executed is, like, as is the case with everyone who is crucified, emblazoned on above his cross so that everyone knows the crime for which he is being punished. Jesus' crime is claiming to be the King of the Jews. Now, this, of course, is one of many, many interpretations about who the historical Jesus was. I said before when we started this conversation that, well, when you're talking about the Christ of faith, you know, he comes in 100 different flavors, but the Jesus of history is frozen in place. Well, it's true, he is frozen in place. But because we know so little about him, and because we have to rely on writings that are far more theological explanations about who he was than they are historical descriptions of what he did, even the historical Jesus can be understood in countless ways, as my critics will tell you. But for me, what I think is most important is what the historical Jesus represents. Because this example of this poor, pious Jewish peasant is one that I think is as relevant today as it was 2,000 years ago. It's funny, when I talk about the difference between the Christ of faith and the Jesus of history, I often get criticized by believers who will say that by removing Jesus' divinity, I'm making him normal. I'm making him not special. I'm making him ordinary. Nothing can be further from the truth. That a man who sacrifices himself on behalf of people who have no voice, and who does so willingly, and who does so by setting an example of how to confront social injustice, how to confront the powers that be, how to confront the gatekeepers of salvation. And by the way, an example that, as I say, is as resonant today as it was 2,000 years ago. To me, that man is extraordinary. That is a man worth knowing. It is, in fact, a man worth following. And I would say that the reason that I wrote this book, besides, of course, my secret Muslim agenda to destroy Christianity, the reason that I wrote this book is to say that you can be a follower of Jesus without necessarily being a Christian, just as you can be a Christian without necessarily being a follower of Jesus. Thank you very much. A good amount of time. 30, is my right? 30 minutes? Am I right? 20 minutes? Okay, 20 minutes for questions. So just please raise your hand and I'll pick at you. I have a very strict rule that I go gentleman, lady, in my questions, and so I will wait all night for a lady to answer. Yes, sir. That's right, that's right. And the Quran, which many of you may not be aware of, recites more or less the entire gospel story in a shortened version. Interestingly enough, like most of the biblical stories that are recounted in the Quran, it always begins with a commandment for the listener to recall or remember. It's a very unusual aspect of the Quran. It always says something to the effect of, remember when Jesus, and then it does this. And it'll say, recall when Moses, and then it'll tell the story. And it's quite clear that it does that because it assumes that the audience listening to this revelation is already familiar with these stories. And I argue in No God But God, the reason for that is because Muhammad lived in a Mecca that was teeming with Jews and Christians, and by the way, Christians of multiple different stripes, especially heterodox Christians that had been forcibly pushed from the Roman Empire into the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula. And so it does provide this kind of shortened version of the Gospels, which matches pretty well with the Christian version of the Gospels. It gets deeper, you're right, into the family heritage, because it's very important to connect Jesus with Abraham, the sort of the most important prophet in Islam, as well as in Judaism, perhaps even in Christianity. What it veers away from the traditional Christian story, however, as you rightly said, is at the end of the story. The Quran says that Jesus, on his way to being crucified, that his spirit left his body, and that someone else was crucified in his stead. And this has become paramount to the Muslim narrative about Jesus, that Jesus was not crucified. Now, Muslims believe that Jesus' spirit went up into heaven and sits at the right hand of God and will return at the end of time to judge humanity. All of that is still the same. It's just this crucifixion part. Well, for me, as a historian, I'm fascinated by how these ideas originate. And this one, actually, it's a pretty simple answer. This notion that Jesus wasn't crucified, that his spirit actually went into somebody else's body and somebody else's spirit went into his body and that person was crucified in his stead, is an old idea. It can be traced all the way to the 2nd century. You find it in the so-called Gnostic Gospels. The Gospel of Philip says very much the same thing. Now, the Gnostics, of course, were before the rise of Christian Rome, were one of multiple varieties of Christianity that existed in the first 2-3 centuries of the faith. But of course, when Emperor Constantine adopted Christianity and began the process of making it the official religion of Rome, though he himself did not do that, it was very important for there to just be one Christianity. You can't have the imperial religion come in 45 different flavors. It can only come in one flavor. And so, thus, the process of Orthodox Christianity was born. Now, the problem with Orthodox Christianity is that if you did not agree with it, you were now no longer a Christian. And so you had a very simple choice. You either were killed, or you got the hell out of Rome as fast as possible. And many of these heterodox Christians, including these Gnostic Christians, fled into the Middle East. So for instance, we have the Copts in Egypt, or we have the Nestorians in Iran and Iraq. But many of these so-called monophysite Christians, these Gnostic Christians, went into the Arabian Peninsula. And indeed, it's very likely that any Christian that Muhammad would have met would have been a Gnostic Christian. Any Christian that Muhammad would have met would have said, Jesus did not get crucified. His spirit went into another body. And indeed, that becomes part of the Islamic narrative. This is what I find so fascinating about the origins of religion, because we have this idea that religions are kind of born in vacuums, right? That a prophet just suddenly shows up from heaven and apropos of nothing begins to reveal a new religion. But prophets don't create religions. Prophets are reformers. Their job is to reform their own religion. Jesus did not create Christianity. Jesus was a Jew preaching Judaism to other Jews. He was reviving Judaism. The Buddha did not create Buddhism. The Buddha was a Hindu. You all know that, right? He was reforming Hinduism. And Muhammad did not create Islam. The Quran repeatedly says this is not a new message. This is the same message that was given to Adam and Isaac and Jacob and Abraham and Moses and Jesus. Their God is your God. It's the prophet's followers who create religions. They are the ones tasked with this Herculean responsibility to take the words and deeds of the prophet and transform them into something that is institutionalized, something that can be actually made concrete. And that's where religions are born. That's what I'm fascinated by, whether it's Islam or Judaism or Christianity. Yes, ma'am. So, very good question. Let me begin by, first of all, noting something that you did. You said ignorant, illiterate. Now, in our society, where in France, the literacy rate is 98%. If you're in a situation in which 98% of your community can read or write, and you can't read or write, you're stupid. That's how we think of you, right? Illiteracy means ignorance. Illiteracy means stupid. But if you're in a society in which 98% of you cannot read or write, illiteracy has absolutely nothing to do with your intelligence or your creativity.
Or your knowledge.
Or your knowledge. It's absolutely the case that Jesus could not read or write. There is no compelling evidence whatsoever to indicate that a poor peasant, any poor peasant, certainly any poor Galilean peasant, could actually read or write. But that does not mean that Jesus did not have an enormous intelligence, a creative intelligence, that he was inundated with the Torah, which he would have heard every time he walked into the synagogue. And by all accounts, he was a deeply pious Jew, came from a family of pious Jews. We can tell that by the way that they named their sons, if nothing else. And so the fact that Jesus takes part in these grand debates, with the rabbis, the learned people, the people who could actually read or write. Despite the fact that he could not read or write, shouldn't surprise us in any way. His illiteracy bears no weight upon his creative genius. And indeed, a colleague of mine has noted that the very fact that the Pharisees would have even engaged with Jesus is an indication that they thought that his argument was worth engaging. That's what the Pharisees did for a living, that they argued, they debated, and if they debated Jesus, then he was worth debating. But that doesn't mean that he was literate. But again, literacy does not mean ignorance, number one. Number two, we have to understand that the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus, were not written by anyone who ever met Jesus. This is a uncomfortable but fundamental fact. No one who ever wrote a single word about Jesus, no one actually met Jesus. The first words ever written about Jesus in the 50s were written by the Apostle Paul. He never met Jesus. The first gospel about Jesus was written by Mark, whoever Mark was, and that was written in about 70. He never met Jesus. Matthew and Luke were written between 90 and 100. They never met Jesus. And John was written somewhere between 100 and 120. He most certainly never met Jesus. So that means that what the Gospels are, again, are not eyewitness accounts of Jesus' words and deeds. What they are theological arguments about who Jesus was. In other words, the Gospel writers already believed something about Jesus. That he was God, that he was the Messiah, that he was the Son of God, whatever. They already believed something about him. And then they wrote their Gospels to prove that belief. So we cannot look at the Gospels as an actual account of Jesus' words and deeds. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not useful. That doesn't mean that there aren't tools in place and have been in place for 2 centuries now to help us figure out what is and what is not more likely historical in the Gospels. We can tease that out. We can pick that out a little bit. And there's still a lot of disagreement and argumentation about it. But when you see Jesus, for instance, fulfilling the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible, that is not Jesus fulfilling the prophecies of the Hebrew Bible. It's the Hebrew Bible being used to convince a reader of who Jesus was. So in other words, it's Jesus, the story of Jesus being manipulated so that it fits one particular passage of the Hebrew Bible. That's the second part of it. And then the third part of it, which was, Jesus was a very conservative Jew. I think that because the Jesus story is read primarily by non-Jews, and because they see him really as not a Jew, maybe his earthly body was Jewish, but if he's God, he's not Jewish, and certainly, we don't see him as preaching Judaism. We think that in those situations in which he is in conflict with, for instance, the Pharisees, it's because Jesus has this radically liberal version of a non-Jewish kind of take on the Jewish law. The exact opposite is true. Jesus said, I have not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. In every case in which Jesus comments on the law in the Gospels, every time he comments on it, and we know that this is probably historically accurate because the early church would not want this to be the case. Every time he comments on it, it's to make it more extreme. He says, oh, you've heard, the law of Moses says do not kill. Well, I say that if you react in anger, you've killed. The law of Moses says do not commit adultery. I say that if you look at someone with lust, you've committed adultery. He is taking what we would now refer to as an extremist view of the law, one that the rabbis and the Pharisees at the time would have seen as just shockingly out there. So you're absolutely right about that case, that he was preaching a firm Jewish revival. Yes, sir? Very good. Well, first, so for those who are unfamiliar with the book, let me just clarify terms for a moment. So Hellenist and Hebrew is what the book of Acts refers to as these two major branches of Christianity. The Hellenists were those Greek-speaking Jews who lived in the diaspora. They were, Hellenists. They were deeply Hellenized. But Hellenist, by the way, was a derogatory term. They were Hellenized, they were Romanized. The very fact that they spoke Greek, that was their primary language, is an indication of a different way in which they thought about things. All you have to do is look at the scriptures that arose from the Greek-speaking diaspora. If you've ever read, for instance, the Enoch corpus, or if you've ever read the Wisdom of Solomon, you really understand why these are not canonized, because they're like Greek philosophical tracts. That's what they read like. The Hebrews were Palestinian Jews, and so in other words, they were the sort of Jews like Jesus, people who lived primarily in the Galilee, but some in Judea and Perea, and like Jesus, they were much less cosmopolitan, much less urban, and very likely illiterate. The first question about, couldn't just James, couldn't he have someone read something of his? No, it's true. I'm not saying that James was unaware of what Paul was preaching. You're talking about this one particular scene that happens in the book of Acts, in which on 3 separate occasions Paul is summoned. James is the brother of Jesus. Yes, he had 4 brothers. James is in charge of the Jesus movement after Jesus' death. This is a guy who's been completely written out of history, and he is probably as important to the early development of Christianity as anyone. After all, Jesus was in charge of the Jesus movement for 3 years. His brother James was in charge of it for 30 years, and yet just wiped away. And that's really the most fascinating part of, I think, this book is James. Everybody loves James. 3 separate times James summons Paul to answer for these sort of what James refers to as deviant teachings. And there's one moment happens the third and final time, in the year, I think it's 60, in the year 60, where he says to Paul, he says, "It's come to our attention that you have been telling the brothers that they no longer need to follow the law of Moses. Now, we know that this cannot be true, and so to put the minds of the brothers at ease, you are going to," and then he describes this very strict Jewish purification ritual that he wants Paul to do at the temple. And Paul goes and does it because you don't say no to the brother of Jesus. My argument, what I was saying there, is that what's funny is that we have read Paul's letters. We know that's exactly what he's been saying. He's been telling people, not only do you not need to follow the law of Moses anymore, he's calling it the law of death chiseled in stone. He's saying Christ is the end of the Torah. And what I'm joking about there is that, James, who can't read, let alone read Greek, is probably unaware of the things that Paul is saying, but has heard about it, and so he says, it's come to our attention that you've been saying these things. That can't be true. And so to prove it's not true, you are going to go to the temple that Paul says is an abomination and has been made irrelevant by Jesus' death, and you're going to take part in this, it's called the Nazarite vow. And Paul does, and that's the last time the two of them meet, because Paul gets arrested and he goes to Rome, and that's where he dies. Wait, what was the second part of your question?
About what drew them.
Oh, what drew them, yeah.
To this Jesus movement.
There are a lot of explanations to that. And the faith-based explanation is just as good. Paul says that he had an ecstatic experience of the risen Jesus. And that the risen Jesus communicated with him on a regular basis. And I don't think we should just sort of deny that. If he says he had this spiritual experience, and that spiritual experience led him to redefine what Jesus was, obviously it worked, since it gave birth to the largest religion in the world. So let's give him some credit. The argument that other scholars have said, and I think it's a good one, is that you have to understand how difficult life is for a Hellenistic Jew living in Antioch, or Ephesus, or Tarsus, for that matter, or Rome. He's living surrounded by Syrians and Arabs and Greeks and Romans. He's sophisticated, he's urbane, he's cosmopolitan, he's well-educated, he speaks Greek, he thinks in Greek. And yet, his entire spirituality is chained to this high priest living 1,000 kilometers away. His money goes to this high priest. He's compelled every year to go and make obeisance to this high priest. And even the law of Moses itself is quite burdensome, if you think about it. If you're living in Jerusalem, it's not that hard. It's not that hard to maintain 580 dietary laws. If you're living in Rome, it's kind of hard to maintain those laws, the purity laws alone. I mean, unless you're bathing in a mikvah every single day, it's impossible to keep your purity. Now here comes this new vision of Judaism. And it says, this is a Judaism divorced from the law. The law is in your, it's a spiritual thing. Christ's blood has washed away your sin forever. So forget about the ritual cleansing. Eat whatever you want to. It doesn't matter anymore. It's not hard to imagine why that would be compelling, right? What we know for a fact is that the Jesus movement floundered in Jerusalem. It was very hard to convince Palestinian Jews, particularly Jews in Jerusalem, who live in the shadow of the temple. It was very hard to convince them of this new movement, of this new idea. And indeed, the community that James establishes there is marked by the fact that it is deeply Jewish. I mean, James thinks this is a Jewish movement for Jews. He's perfectly happy if non-Jews join this movement, as long as they become Jews first. In the year 57, because of Peter, of all people, in the year 57, Peter convinces him to finally forego the requirement of circumcision to join this movement, which, marketing-wise, is a good idea. But James says, fine, you don't have to be circumcised, but you have to follow every law of Moses, all of it, including the dietary laws, because we are Jews following a Jew. That works in Jerusalem, but more and more, as this thing spreads in the Roman Empire, James loses control of it, and it begins to morph into something else. Not something Roman just yet. That won't happen until after 70. It's still Jewish, but it's a different kind of Jewish. It's a deeply Hellenistic, Greek-inspired Jewish. Those Jews are much more open to this new way of thinking than the Palestinian Jews are. Am I out of time? One very quick question, yes. Well, first of all, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, religious literacy is so vital in this world. I mean, hopefully we're all done with the whole God is dead thing, right? Because the 20th century proved that that's not true. God is still very much alive around the world. And if you really want to understand international relations, if you want to understand, cultures, if you even want to understand globalization, then you have to be religiously literate, because religion still plays an incredibly important part in the very identity of countless people around this planet. So I think religious literacy is as important as historical literacy. So I do think it's important to do this, but I think it begins with recognizing the difference between religion and faith. The reason that religion is so often not taught in school is because most people are incapable of thinking about religion and faith as different things. Faith is inexpressible, it's indefinable, it's deeply individual, it's nebulous. It's something that is almost impossible to express. Religion is just a man-made system of symbols and metaphors to help you express it. That's it. And like any kind of man-made system, communism, nationalism, any kind of man-made system, it should be taught. It should be learned as a part of the history of Western civilization, the history of human civilization. But because we are so loath to kind of make that differentiation, to divorce faith from religion, it brings up all these very sticky issues, which is why I think we are, for the most part, multiple generations upon generations of religiously illiterate people, and many of us, particularly those in Europe, sort of, forgive themselves for it because they convince themselves that religion is just not important. Well, maybe it may not be important in your neighborhood in Paris, but it is still deeply important around the world. At the beginning of the 20th century, 1/2 of the world's population identified itself with one of the 5 major religions: Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, Islam. 100 years of secularism, of scientific advancement, of economic development, that number is now 2/3. So let's not kid ourselves. People still take religion very seriously, and so should we. Thank you.